This is Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Let's get into it. All right, guys, we've got a special return guest to the podcast today. His name is J. Warner Wallace. So he is a cold case homicide detective, popular national speaker, and a best-selling author. He's been on the show twice before, so this is his third appearance. He was on episode 508 and 275. He actually became a follower of Christ at the age of 35 after he used some of his detective skills to investigate the New Testament and the Gospels. He eventually got his master's degree in Theological Studies from Gateway Seminary. You've likely seen him on shows like Dateline NBC. He's also been on Court TV and Fox News and stuff like that, but he is the best-selling author of books like God's Crime Scene and Forensic Faith. And we spend most of our time today talking about his new book right here, which is called The Truth in True Crime. And so I really like talking to Jim. He's one of my favorite people to talk to on the show, just because we can go into any subject matter without having to really grease the skids very much. Like we can just flow from thing to thing. And so that's Roman the Giant saying hello. Thank you for that shake, Roman. Appreciate you very much. But we talk about how this book is different than a lot of his other offerings and kind of how he got to be able to do that. But then he has a quote in there about some of the murder cases that he hasn't been able to solve as a cold case detective. So I talked to him about what's that like? You're sitting there at night and you're just by yourself and you're thinking about these murders that you haven't been able to solve. How do you deal with that? Then we talked about the importance of objective morality. We talked about how in modernity we put a lot of stock in our identity, but we get our identity from silly things like, our chosen LGBTQ plus identity, or how many followers we have on Instagram, or how many people listen to our show, or something like that. So we get into that. We talk about the importance of men's community and building that community of guys around you. And guys, you've heard me talk about it before, the foxhole, the 3 a.m. guy, but we get his perspective on that as well. We talk a little bit about marriage. We talk a little bit about all of our capacities for potential malevolence. Yeah. So we really dig into certain things, like there's a darkness inside of a lot of us that I think we don't really reckon with. We talk about something really cool, like what all gangsters have in common, which is a really cool thing. That's actually the title of one of his chapters. And then we flowed into a bunch of other topics, but even at the very end, we really dug into some stuff that's very, very important for fathers, especially fathers with young children. So guys, you're going to want to stick around for all of that. So without further ado, let's get into it. Jim, welcome back. This is your third appearance on Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. And I do ask this for people that have come on and been on several times. You've had a lot of accolades. You had very, very, successful writing career and, investigations and cold case and all that. But this has got to be up there for you. I mean, 3 times now you've been on this show. I mean, that's got to be top tier for you, is it not?
Well, yeah, it is. And I don't want to blow smoke here, but the reality of it is that this is the kind of show that I'm most interested in doing, because I think it's an not underserved maybe, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, that the role of men in Christianity, I think, is we have to do something, and we have to really, I think, hopefully, spend time articulating why men ought to be involved and engaged and crazy about this, and give their lives to it, form their identity around it, all the things that I don't see us doing in the church. And that's something that, as a cop, now look, I do a lot of work with both male and female police officers, but it's still dominantly a male job because of the physicality of it, probably. And so this is the audience I'm trying to reach, because this was my career. So yeah, that's why if you have asked me to come on a 4th time, I'm going to come on, because it feels like this is the audience we need to reach. Well,
you don't have to keep writing books to keep coming on the show, but it's just a good reminder, because when you release a new book every 17 minutes, it's like, I got to get Jim back on the show. And we'll get into your latest book here in a second. But I did want to talk about something that you said that you were doing, that you mentioned before you hopped on, but you're doing something with the Billy Graham group. I think you said you just got back from Alaska. You said this was on the marriage subject. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we just got back 2 days ago from the first of 3 sessions we'll be doing up there, 2-week sessions. So we'll be there a total of 6 weeks. This is a retreat that BGA uniquely offers, Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, and uniquely offers for police officers and their spouses. And all of these folks have been involved in critical incidents, many of which they were thought they weren't going to make it, and were critically injured. A lot of them get back to work. And so we do have some that come back to work. Or maybe are actually still working. A lot of them are on the verge of medical retirement, and it shakes them. And so a lot of it has to do with identity. And so some of the stuff I wrote about in Truth and True Crime was really amplified. It was the stuff that I would talk to officers about to kind of help them kind of get back on their feet. A lot of them come up, they're not saved, they're not Christians. So it's just an opportunity to spend a week with 4 couples, and it's intense. It's pretty involved. But at the end of that, people find themselves in a better place, both in their marriage and kind of in how they see the world. So a lot of it is like Christian worldview stuff that we're doing, but it is dealing with like, what is the nature of trauma? How do we get through trauma? What's the best way to flourish post trauma? We talk a lot about why we're struggling to begin with in terms of identity or where we place our worship. Those kinds of things matter, but I don't think a lot of people think about them seriously until they get in a tight spot. So that's what we're doing with them. We go back again in 2 more weeks. So we have 2 weeks in August. 2 weeks in June, 2 weeks in July, 2 weeks in August this year. But this is our 3rd year at this location, our 4th year in total with BGEA doing this for police officers. And we also jumped in and volunteered a little bit with the Operation Heal Our Patriots before that, which is for military personnel. So they offer the same thing for military personnel. And so it's been just a great opportunity to do this. But boy, it's a lot of work, and it is draining because you have to jump in the hole with people, and sometimes it's dark. But that's just the nature of empathy, right? So you just jump in the hole.
And so I would assume the answer to this is yes, but is it because they are in a post-trauma state that the soil is more fertile, I guess, for you to drum up these ideas about worldview and kind of get to the spiritual? Because I notice with men, I got to kind of break you down a little bit physically before I can start talking to your brain, because your brain's telling you to stop doing this and I'm telling you to keep going. And then you have to break through that to even get to the spiritual conversation where they're so exhausted and so exasperated that you can kind of hit some of those subjects. Is that kind of what you see?
Yeah, that's a good point. I do think that nobody eats until they're hungry.
Yeah.
Nobody buys a new car until the old car is not running anymore. So there's a sense in which, yes, I often think that you don't need to know more in order to investigate this. You need to surrender more. And that's hard because what keeps us away from the truth sometimes is that we think we know better. Mm-hmm. It's a pride issue. And I think sometimes life can bruise your pride, and then you're maybe willing to listen. So one of the things we talk about is one of the chapters of this book I just wrote is about like, what is the one thing that makes you a better learner? It turns out there's secular research on this. The thing that makes you a better learner is also the thing that contributes to almost every other aspect of recordable human flourishing, from longevity, mental health, physical health, that your committed relationships, how much you can learn, how able you are to learn, better grades, better financial achievement. All of these markers that we typically use for human flourishing are improved by this one thing called, according to the research in the last 35 years, humility. No, what a shock. It turns out that humble people learn at a higher, faster rate because they don't think they already know the answer. They're willing to say, you know what, maybe I'm not right. So humility is a key to all of this. Now, look, you can either decide that I want to flourish and adopt humility. And by the way, that's really hard. We can talk about that. Or what can happen is life can punch you in the face and force you into a position of humility. But either way will work in terms of positioning you to learn something new. So I do think that people come sometimes because they are now in that position of humility. But I think the other thing, though, Kyle, is that a lot of the guys I'm dealing with in this, and this is why I feel like we need to stay in that ministry as long as they'll have us, is that these are case makers. These are cops or case makers. They're constantly building cases in their head, every interaction with somebody out in the street. If it's going to go to an arrest, they've got to make a case in their head as to why this is going to be an arrest, why this is going to head in this direction. How am I going to present this on my report? How is this going to be presented to a DA? How is it ultimately going to be presented to a jury? This is case making from start to finish. And case makers are typically the kind of people who want you to make a case. And that's the nature of their job. So I think that we're in a position where we can say, well, you could make a case for this. And that's what my early books have always tried to do. And so that's kind of, I think it helps. So two things. One, they've been in a position, or we try to help them to see why humility will help them in their marriage. And then two, leveraging that humility, we make a case. And I think those two things are helpful together.
Yeah, the humility piece is so big because I don't think humility is modeled enough. So that's one thing that I do with my boys. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old son. And so when dad, loses it for a second, flies off the handle or, acts out in anger or something like that, I try to be quick to apologize to my boys and to show them like, hey, I'm going to humble myself and ask you for forgiveness. Now, if you do that 17 times a day, it's just going to start to ring a little hollow. But if you can spread that out maybe throughout a year, you're teaching your kid humility. But that's another another reason why I encourage men to do jujitsu, because it's like jujitsu is one of those few things that you can't just be an athlete and be good at it, right? Because we all know that guy that no matter what he did, no matter what ball he picked up, first time he picked up a football, it was a spiral. First time he shot a 3-pointer, it was swish. Like, we all know guys like that. You can't do that with jujitsu. Like, I've heard the quote, you can't athlete out of stuff. Like, you're not going to accidentally triangle choke someone the first time that you've been on the mat. And so you're just going to get brutalized for years and years and years. And there's always someone badder and better than you. And so if you've got an ego problem, if you've got a humility problem, like, that'll just knock it right out of you, because it's either you're going to stick around and, keep taking the medicine, or you're not. And so I appreciate that perspective on that as well. But I guess it would be worth our time to get into the newest book. Again, you've written about 74 books at this point, but the newest one, guys, is The Truth in True Crime. You heard me talk about it in the intro. What investigating death teaches us about the meaning of life. So I want to read a quote from the preface here. This book is different. It contains truths about life gleaned from investigations about death. Great line, by the way. It also includes the surprisingly accurate description of human nature found not in the latest scientific journals, but in the ancient pages of the Bible. So why this book? Why now? Why you?
Well, if I could have written this book first, I would have. I started writing apologetics books because I was working as a youth pastor, just finishing up as a youth pastor, and I was with Sean McDowell training his high school students to get ready for an immersive trip at UC Berkeley, where we're going to be encountering atheists. And I was training them on the reliability of Scripture, the way I had done my youth groups for years. And he saw the presentation to his students, and he said, "You should write a book about that." And that ultimately became, I didn't think I had time to do that, but he helped me to get my, light a fire to do that. So I owe it to John for a book called Cold Case Christianity, which was the first book I wrote. Now, if he'd have said, if I'd have been teaching, if he'd have asked me to teach his students about humility, then I would have written a different book first. And in some ways, I look back at that and I say, well, I look back and I think, well, is that really because once you start writing a book for a publishing house, that's how they see you.
Yeah.
And then there's like, okay, now we want more of those, especially if the book does well. So then I ended up in a string of these books. And years ago, I started pitching this book because this is the one that I thought was the most important. This is because by the time I was writing Cold Case Christianity, I was probably 6 or 7 years beyond being interested, not interested, but and actually it's more than that. It's like 15 years beyond being like, I'd already crossed that bridge.
Yeah.
I crossed that bridge to become a Christian. And by the time I wrote Cold Case Christianity, I was really trying to figure out, how does Christianity meet the road? Like, how do we live this? Like, what does it say about how we ought to be living? And that's the stuff that I was most interested in. But maybe it's good that you wait till you're 62 to write a book like this, because then you really have stubbed your toe enough times to kind of test some of these ideas out. But so I've been pitching this book for a while. When I signed with Zondervan, I wanted to write this book first, but they said, no, we kind of want something that is about Jesus, in the Jesus space, you know? And so I thought, well, when I first did that investigation years ago, there was a bunch of stuff I looked at that I didn't write about in Cold Case. So I thought, what could be like a partner book to Cold Case that would cover the stuff I didn't write about in Cold Case? That became a book called Person of Interest. So I wrote Person of Interest first. And then I think I earned the right with Zondervan to write this book, which is the book I really think is the most important book I've written. It's the stuff that's most interesting to me. I had been compiling a list of about 40 attributes of human nature that I had been watching and experiencing as a homicide detective that I always wanted to talk about, because it's like, wow, you see that? You see that right there? That's common. What you just saw right there, I see that in 90% of our suspects. And it turns out that I see that in us. I see that in my partner and I. Like we all share this common attribute, and then you get a chance to see what it looks like on someone's worst day. And it helps you, I think, to figure out like, hey, you know, how can we regulate this in some way to help people leverage this truth to become better at whatever they're doing. And so that's kind of what this book does. It takes a look at 15 attributes of human nature that you find in crime scenes. And I tell some crime stories. So it's part true crime. It's part self-help. There's 15 rules for life here. And it's part, you could say there's kind of a kind of sideways apologetic, because if Christianity is true, it ought to describe us the way we really are. And it turns out it does. So that's what I wanted to be able to illustrate in the book. So that's kind of what this book's about. It's a little different than my other apologetics books. I think that that's something interesting, Kyle. You have to turn corners. And sometimes a social media world does not allow you to turn corners. I remember when Lee Strobel first wrote a fiction novel. He only wrote one because it's almost like his audience didn't allow him to turn a corner. And so if that's the case for me here, that's fine. I mean, I see what we do for me. What we do in terms of posting content, it's like a spiritual discipline. The same way that I'm going to read scripture, I'm going to pray, I'm going to, do all the things that we do, we consider spiritual disciplines. I can't help but want to create content about Jesus. And it's part of my everyday. Right now, I'm just so obsessed with just reading scripture, but I go through seasons where I'm more or less obsessed with it, just the nature of life. But this is something that I feel like is a spiritual. I had to write this book. So that's what this book is.
Well, it is very interesting to see the difference between Person of Interest and The Truth and True Crime, because Person of Interest was my first foray into your work. That was your first appearance on the show, was talking about that book. But there are similarities there as well. But you're right. I mean, I think I remember, when Jim Carrey did like the Truman Show, everyone's like, wait, where's Ace Ventura? I don't want this like serious guy like doing like this dramatic thing. Or he tried to do a couple of thrillers. They're like, no, we want to see you with a bowl cut and a chipped tooth saying stupid things. That's what we want to see you doing. And so you kind of get typecasted a little bit. Now, this is tangentially related to the book, and I do want to get into some of the different leads, because you don't call them chapters, you call them leads. But there's a quote from the preface where you say, "The murder of Kathy Jacobson remains one of my open, unsolved mysteries." I just want to know what that's like, because again, you're a cold case detective. You're solving these cold cases sometimes that are decades old, right? So all the leads have gone cold. There's no DNA from back in the day. Like it's a seemingly impossible task. And it's also seemingly impossible to assume that you're going to solve all of them. But I feel like we don't really reckon with the fact that when you're sitting there, watching a ball game, having a bourbon, and you're thinking about Kathy Jacobson, and you're thinking about, this woman's murderer could still be out there. And, I wasn't able to put this person to justice. So just tell me a little bit more about that, because I mean, for somebody that's a civilian that never works cases like that or all that, like I can't fathom it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll be honest, I don't think I've really much thought about the unsolved. I mean, I do think about the cases, and there's two ways you think about them. But number one, there's a bunch of cases that we didn't even get a chance to look at that are unsolved in our agency, and nobody worked these cases typically. Once they go cold and that detective is reassigned, these things kind of get lost unless a family continues to push and bring it to the forefront of the agency. That's why I always tell victim families, hey, you just need to constantly, on every single anniversary of that dead person's life, their birthday, their death date, whatever it may be, you need to write another letter and send it to the agency. And eventually someone's going to pick it up. But it's the ones where families kind of move on, sadly. And there are a lot of those, sadly, where families kind of it's hopeless. They don't recontact the agency. So I would say two things. Number one, there's a pride issue. I hate to say that, but there is. Mm-hmm. So if you've touched a case, there's a good chance someone's eventually going to solve it. And then you're going to be on Dateline as the guy who didn't solve it. So tell you what, if you're going to open it up, solve it.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to be the guy who's just another one of these detectives who couldn't move the case. I have cases like that where I picked them up, did a ton of work. That's one of those cases where we're on those porches swabbing potential suspects. And eventually we run out of people to swab. And then you're like, okay, what do I do with this now? This is an unsolved case still. Do I think it will get, we've had some movement on that case in the last 5 years that it's quite possible that it will get solved, but it won't because of me, because I never got close to figuring out who it was. But that's a case, I changed, I think I say this in the first preface of the book, that I changed details, dates, names on cases. And I exchanged some of the details because I don't want, especially open cases like that one, I don't really want people to know where it's at until it's solved. But that's a case that is still open. There's lots more detail to that case I could have provided, but I just don't want to go in that direction right now. But I do think about it, and I don't think about it in terms of some of these cases. Look, they're so old. There's a very good chance that whoever did this has been dead for years.
Yeah.
You're talking about cases in the 80s. And I've got a case it was 1972. By the time we solved it in 2019, I think the guy had been dead a few years. So some of these, I don't look at it and say, oh, there's a serial killer on the loose. But could that person, if they had been caught, the day they did it? Could we perhaps have prevented a few more murders? Yes, but probably by the time I open it, we're well past that. But now we just want justice for the family. And that's one of the things we're trying to do here, Kyle, is we can't get closure. And I like families want it to end. Of course, it's not going to end. I can convict the killer and not return your dead daughter.
Right.
It's not going to end. But I do think if we work hard, we can sometimes get justice, but we're not going to get closure.
Very good. Well, I appreciate you going into that. Well, let's dig into some of the leads, and let's go ahead and go into lead 1 or chapter 1, if you will. This one's called A Pool of Blood Under My Feet. So I'm actually going to leave the anecdote for the reader because it's probably my favorite. It was the first one, but it's probably my favorite story because it's just such a goofball thing. And like whenever I think of you, Jim, I don't think of goofball. And so guys, you'll have to, I'll save that for the book itself, but I want to read a quote from lead 1. If objective transcendent wisdom is morally grounded, as philosophers, theologians, and even scientists agree, then it requires an objective transcendent source for moral truth. That kind of wisdom is unavailable if moral truths are simply personal or collective opinions. And so this is obviously getting into this postmodern ideal where, your truth is your truth, mine is my truth. There's no such thing as objective morality. And the thing is people will say that, but they don't actually live that way. They live as if objective morality is a real thing, and they live as if doing the right thing is the right thing, and that we can all kind of colloquially agree to what the right thing is. But talk to me a little bit more about that, because there are a lot of people that have really bought into this lie that I can't tell you what you're deciding to do is wrong because you have your own lived experience.
Yeah. Well, so look, even if I said that I think it's wrong for people to enforce or to project their beliefs about morality on me, that's a wrong. Well, then you think that moral belief, that it's wrong to project your moral beliefs, is objectively true. You think it's true for all of us. You don't think that you don't have any problem at all enforcing that moral truth. So there's no way to avoid the enforcement of objective. Now, when I say objective, what I mean is truths that transcend personal opinions. In other words, is it okay to torture babies for fun? Is that a matter of personal opinion? Is that a matter of collective opinion that societies can decide it's okay? Or do we think that there are some things that transcend? I don't care who you are on planet Earth, where you lived, what time you lived in history. It was never okay to do this. In other words, it's grounded not in you as the subject deciding if it's okay. It's grounded in the act itself. The object under consideration here is the moral act. So it's grounded in the object known as the moral act, not in the subject who's evaluating it. It's an objective claim about morality. Now, look, why is this important? Because it turns out, as you study wisdom from a scientific perspective, I mean a secular perspective, I cite a study in this book, for example, that says that at least one pillar of wisdom, and this is a wisdom book, one pillar of wisdom is moral. That's according to the secular philosophy. What do they mean? Well, so for example, if I said, is there a wise way to do a bank robbery? Is there a wise way to do a kidnapping? Is there a wise way to do a rape? Okay. What do you mean? In other words, it seems like the act itself is unwise. In other words, it's not, what you mean, is there a way to be more successful? Or do you mean, is it truly wise to even do a bank robbery, to even do one of these heinous crimes? Well, it turns out there's a moral component that you would say by its very nature, some things are unwise because they are immoral. Okay, so if wisdom has a moral component, then the question becomes, who gets to decide the moral nature of something? So I could say, look, there's a wise way to live in the streets as a gangster and interact with other gangsters and shoot people who disrespect you. And these are all things that are part of the moral code of the street. Are we willing to say that all moral codes are just developed by groups? Because then what do we do with street gangs who hold, there's a code amongst thieves.
Yep.
Is that the code we ought to be living by? So it turns out that the very first chapter of this book, I hope, demonstrates that, look, if you really want to be wise, one of those components is going to have to be the moral pillar that the secular researchers identify in Ivy League schools. So if that's the case, well, you're already stuck with some kind of transcendent grounding for morality. And that's why your lived experience is not going to be, because I guarantee you, I've actually interviewed gangsters who have done something heinous and said, well, yeah, but yesterday they came over and did that to us. Look, they know how this works. They know if they come over here and do this to us, we're just going to return the favor tomorrow. That's the way it works on the street. Okay, so there's a moral code. Okay, then therefore we're not going to arrest you? No, we actually think, and it's not like we're saying, well, we're a bigger group, so our moral code matters more than yours. If we're going to play that game of the bigger group, no, it turns out that all of us, when we write laws in the state of California or any other state, we are trying to tap into something that transcends just our view in California. We're actually trying to create a law that represents something that we believe is transcendent. Well, how do you ground those kinds of things? Remembering that all moral codes are obligations between persons. In other words, I have no moral obligation to this cup. I can hit it, I can crack it, I can spit on it. There's no, it's an object. Moral obligations are between persons. I can't, if the person who holds the cup, I can't do those things to that person because it's a person. So if there are objective moral obligations, and I think there are, the only question left is, who is the objective moral person to whom I'm obligated? You see, we're going to get really close to having to adopt something that is grounded in some form of theism, where there's an objective, transcendent source of righteousness by which we measure anything and call it unrighteous or immoral or evil. So I think you're kind of stuck, right? When you start with this idea of wisdom, I mean, we need to teach this to our kids. Now, I think there's actually 4 components to wisdom. And one of the other ones also important is just, hey, make age-appropriate mistakes. Yeah. And I call these age-appropriate mistakes. This mistake I made in the book is a mistake I made the first time I was on a murder scene. But if you're making that mistake 10 years in, you're an idiot. But why? Because it's not age-appropriate anymore. Mm-hmm. You know, make age-appropriate mistakes like jujitsu. You're going to fight better 5 years in than you do. You can make a mistake in the first year and everyone goes, yeah, he just never had that move. He never had to respond to that kind of a move before. But if you've responded to it 10 times and you're still making the same mistake, people are starting to think you're unteachable.
Something's wrong.
You're just not wise. So at some point, what we're doing here is we're saying, hey, it's okay. Be courageous and allow yourself to readily and eagerly make age-appropriate mistakes, because wisdom is born out of those kinds of mistakes. But ground them in a transcendent moral view of the world. You're going to have some knowledge. So I just try to build a collective case for what is the nature of wisdom, so that hopefully, as you're reading this book or anyone else's book, you can say, okay, now you can actually make a claim like that was wise, because it's grounded in something you can define.
Well, and that was always the problem with the 4 horsemen, of which there are 3 left, of new atheism, because it's like, okay, if we are highly evolved chimps that evolved from fish, that evolved from goo, that evolved from stardust, then none of this really matters. This is all preferential. And no, you cannot give a scientific grounding for why it's not okay to torture babies for fun. That's why you have to have the moral code with which to differentiate between good and evil. And there are ways of attaining that. Now, I want to go into lead number 2. This is where it's called fake IDs and stolen identity. So in this chapter, Jim, you talk about identity and how it matters. But in modernity, we derive our value from our social media identity. We also get it from the groups that we opt into. Maybe, I'm thinking about the panoply of LGBTQ plus identities, and, maybe you're identifying as a furry, as an animal or something like that. Maybe we identify with a diagnosis that we've gotten from a school counselor who is completely qualified, obviously, to tell you that you have some sort of psychological issue going on and that you need medication for it. And so we're looking and we're running around, Jim, trying to find identity in something. Some people, their identity is, as a Dodgers fan, or as, a Jacksonville Jaguars fan. Like, we find our identity in these groups, because when our group wins, we get to win, even though we didn't do anything. And so let's just talk more about identity, because, this is something that I've personally had to fight, Jim, because I used to be the biggest St. Louis Cardinals fan on the planet, and I would live and die with each pitch. Now, 162 game season plus the playoffs, that's a lot of pitches. So like hundreds of thousands of times a year, I was living and dying with what I wanted to happen on a particular play. And it just got to a point I was like, what am I doing? Like, why am I ruining everyone's night because my favorite baseball team lost a game in June? Like, this is the dumbest thing that could possibly happen, but it was an identity. My identity was wrapped up in it. So go flow on that for a bit.
Well, then it does go to show that how much your identity is tied up into things that you worship, misplaced worship,
for
right?
Sure.
Idolatry. But anyway, that's another chapter of the book. But I would just say that I think now, as I work with officers and work with just people in general, and myself, even my colleagues who work as speakers talking about Christianity, I think identity is the biggest issue that we need to address. Even if you think, well, I don't have a problem with that. No, you probably do. And every time that you experience trauma or suffering or just a little hiccup, even in your day, I suggest. So here's what I've noticed. When someone suffers a trauma, almost always, they suffer also at the same time, simultaneously, a shift in their identity. So, for example, if I say I'm a jiu-jitsu fighter and I've got a big match coming up and I suffer a loss, maybe it's my first loss. Well, for years, I identified myself as the undefeated master of my sport. And now suddenly I got to rethink who I am. Or maybe you just thought, and I see this a lot with officers, I can take this guy. And then he takes me. And I had to reassess who I think I am. I thought I was capable at a certain level. And now I realize I'm not. I'm not the guy I thought I was. I was married and now I'm divorced. I'm not the woman I thought I was. I was a mom and now my kids are all left the house. Like, who am I now? It turns out that every time we suffer any sense of struggle, we almost always are simultaneously experiencing a shift in identity.
Right.
And it works the other way too. So in other words, not just does trauma shift your identity, but a shift in your identity will cause trauma. It works both ways. Now, why does that matter? Because if you put your identity in something that is shiftable, then get ready. You're going to have a roller coaster life.
Right.
Because something's always going to come along that's going to punch your identity and shift it. And then you're going to be like, okay, now who am I? So if I didn't care a lick about God, a lick about Christianity, but I was just interested in having a life with less valleys, I would say, put your identity in something that doesn't shift. Because if you think, and men are the worst about this. Let me give a shameless plug to Joe Martin, who's a biblical counselor, Dr. Joe Martin. I was having a conversation with him about this, and here's what he said about men. Maybe you and I have talked about this, I don't know. But he says that men are so ridiculous about identity, and it's all in our conversations that we have in the first 5 minutes with each other, and it's all about the Asians in conversations. Here's what he means. First thing we're going to do, shake hands. What do you do?
Yep.
No, we don't care what you do. We don't care what you do. We're trying to figure out who you are.
Yeah.
And we know that as men, that's probably the same thing.
Right.
That it turns out our first identity is locked in our occupation. That's the first Asian. And we're looking at that occupation and we're thinking, oh, he's a doctor. I know what kind of an education that requires.
Yep.
Education is the second way we measure. Oh, and he's a brain surgeon. That's probably got some good money. Compensation is the next Asian. What are we doing here? We're evaluating. And by the way, all identity is comparative. It's all comparative. That's the bad thing about identity. Identity is you compared to others. So if it's not about how rich you are, it's how rich am I compared to you? How smart you are. How smart am I compared to you? It's very, very notoriously divisive because it's all about comparison. The next Asian, he would say, is, well, are you good at it? Reputation is the next station. And finally, he says, for men, you could have none of those things. You could be the poorest, least educated, the least reputation in the room. But if you're 6'8" and cut like a linebacker from Arizona State, you're still going to be the alpha dog. Why? Because the most important thing probably is intimidation. That's the last station. So I thought when we talked about that with him, I thought, this is how, men aren't the only one who do this. We all form our identity in one of three ways. And I try to cover these in the book. These aren't my definitions. At least the first two aren't. These are kind of the broad work over the last several decades related to identity. Eric Erickson's done a lot of work on this, for example. And the idea is that you either form your identity from the outside in, like the ancients did. Your dad's a farmer, you're going to be a farmer. Your dad is a Wallace, I'm a Wallace. These things pre-existed you. It's your tribe, it's your nation, it's your ethnicity, it's your family occupation, something that pre-existed you that you look outside and you go, I'm one of those. And you just identify with it and draw it to yourself. Outside in formation. The other is inside out formation. And that is simply the more modern version. That is, I just have a desire of my heart, an inclination. Maybe it's an innate skill, my own personal lived experience. These can be the things, even your sexual preference, these things that you hold in your heart uniquely, subjectively. These now become the way you identify yourself, and you simply tell the world, this is how you will identify me. It's an inside out identification. By the way, both of those are dangerous because they can both be shifted. Like I formed my identity off my job for so many years that when I finally left the job, I struggled for probably 5 years. I just changed my bios this week.
Wow.
I mean, I had cold case detective as the leading descriptor. I had Dateline as my leading descriptor. I haven't been on Dateline, I think, in 4 years. Okay, what am I doing? Well, because I saw myself for so many years that way, that to stop seeing myself that way was to kind of stop existing. That's how strong identity formation is. So we have to really be honest about it. Like how do we identify? What impact does it have on us? And get real. You need to put your identity. The third way is the best way because it doesn't shift. And that's simply topside down. If there's a transcendent God who is unchanging, and my identity is now in that God, that's a hard shift to make, though, folks, because we are surrounded by the real world that is visible to us. And but you'd be far better off placing your identity in a transcendent God who doesn't always seem like he's available to us. Seems like he's hidden often. But if you'll do that, well, then when you suffer the trauma, you won't also suffer an identity shift. So the valley will be a little bit less deep. And so I think for us, we have to kind of figure out for our kids. And by the way, if you're forming your identity based on an inside out thing, a desire you have, well, then get ready. Because sometimes people will form it based on their skills. Like, hey, I'm a podcaster. Yeah, I see myself as a podcaster. That's what or I'm a YouTuber. Or I'm a YouTuber in men's ministry. Well, there's always going to be somebody who does it better, has a bigger audience. And then we're going to struggle with, well, who am I compared to that guy? I do this, but I'm not the best at it. Well, that doesn't sit well with anyone. But you want to put your identity in a place where it turns out that you are loved in a way that cannot be matched. So that you don't have to worry, well, yeah, if I'm in Christ and you're in Christ, I'm not worried that God loves you more in Christ than he loves me, or that I'm less a person to God than you are, or more a person to God than you are. In other words, these are the kind of things that could actually unite us. And they're the kinds of things that could protect us from shifts.
Hey guys, real quick, as you've likely heard me talk about on the show before, it took me forever before I started taking supplements of any kind. I was always nervous about taking like whey protein and creatine or really anything beyond that because I was just afraid of what was in the product and if it was going to like give me cancer someday or something like that. And I was always scared of these companies, these supplement companies, just cutting corners and using low quality products and eventually putting things in their products that could cause problems for me and my body. So I've always wanted to partner up with an American company that uses high quality ingredients in their supplements. And that's why I want to remind you guys that we are partnered with Jocko Fuel. So Jocko Fuel is Jocko Willink's American-based supplement company. So what are some of my favorite products that they make that I also use? They have the best tasting greens powder on the market. I love the peach flavor myself. They also make whey protein powder. The banana cream is my favorite. They make energy drinks, the Jocko Go energy drinks. My favorite is currently a tie between their iced tea lemonade and their pink lemonade flavors. I also use their Creel oil, their creatine, their vitamin D, and also their sleep aids. And they make a bunch of other stuff like ready to drink protein cookies, which are actually really delicious. My boys even like them, pre-workout powder, and much, much more. Guys, if you take your health and wellness seriously, then you've got to put high-quality products in your body. Try Jocko Fuel out today by going to www.jockofuel.com. That's jockofuel.com. Use the promo code UNDAUNTED to get 10% off of your order. Again, that's jockofuel.com, promo code UNDAUNTED to get 10% off of your order. There's something important that you actually did for me after our last call. So the last interview we did, we were talking about the 10-year anniversary of Cold Case Christianity. And before we got off the call, and this didn't come up in our conversation, so it was just interesting that you felt the need to say this. I don't even remember if you remember saying this, but you go, hey, Kyle, no matter what, you just keep going. Don't look at the numbers. Don't look at the followers. Don't look at the responses. Don't look at the comments. Don't look at any of that. What you're doing is so vitally important. We need guys like you out there. Don't get bogged down. And what you didn't know, which, okay, Holy Spirit, good for you. But what you didn't know was in that moment, I was having some comparison problems because I was like, man, look at some of these people that. They're not doing things the way that I would do it. And of course I'm right. And why am I not getting the same type of play as people like this? And so it was helpful for me to hear that from you, because you're very accomplished. You've done very, very well, but you can find yourself in the same exact area, because unless you're the greatest, the best-selling author of all time in all categories, you're always going to find someone to compare to. But that really does, it dovetails into what you talk about in chapter 3 or lead 3, because it's called a target, a bullseye, and a circle of concern. Is you're talking about the crucial role of community. Now, I've beaten this drum for a long time about creating a foxhole of guys that, your 3 a.m. friends that that they will be on their way to your house to help you do everything up to and including burying a body that, Jim and his team are going to have to find out later, how we did it all, right? And so,
who do you know who's that reliable, right? Yeah, exactly.
Hey, I got to tell you, I found out this year I got some gangsters in my crew, and my goodness, some of the things they offered to do. But that's a conversation for another time. But there's just such an unbelievably crucial role for community, and men don't take it seriously at all. Like Jim, I know some men that I just love with all my heart. They are lonely. They are bitter. They are stiff-arming any kind of community because this is the way I am. This is the way the world is. And this is just the way it's got to be. And I just hear these horrible stories about these men in these nursing homes that are sitting there bitter, lonely, and angry, and nobody's coming to visit them, and because nobody loves them, and nobody will be at their funeral except for maybe their nurse and the local priest or something like that, because nobody has cared about this person because they've not allowed anyone to care. So talk a little bit, because you have a 90% male audience you're talking to right now, because maybe if the way I've said it hasn't landed, maybe the way you'll say it's going to land. So ready, set, go.
Well, okay. So look, the studies show this. If you wanted to flourish and live longer, and when they look at happiness studies, and probably the longest longitudinal study ever done in this area is like 60 years. It's out of an Ivy League school in the East where they tracked men and women. It turns out that the thing that will provide the most satisfaction in your life, the highest degree of flourishing and happiness, is relationships, and not just any kind of relationship, a certain kind of friendship. Like you can tell the difference between men and women just in the way we communicate. It's been said that men are really good about, when they talk to anyone, their concern is the report. Like what's the data? What happened over here? Women aren't as concerned about the report, the data. They're concerned about rapport. Very different about relation. The whole point of communication for women typically is relationship building. That's not usually what we're after. We're just changing data. I want to know something from you. You want to know something from me. We're not looking at it like an opportunity to connect. But it turns out that if you want to thrive, the connections are huge. Why would that be the case? Well, I can get back to that. There's a theological reason for that, I think. But more importantly, the data shows that a certain kind, now look, cops are really bad about this. And I'm really bad about this, because I often would say the reason, you can handle some of the worst crimes that are doable. You can do them if you simply draw a tight circle around the people for whom you're willing to cry. And my circle is really tight. So, I mean, I could, the only people in my circle are my wife and my kids and my dog before she passed. She was in that circle. My cats have never been in those circles. Yeah. So, they're out. But the point is, I could work a family member. I could work a niece or a nephew. Why? Because I won't allow people in my circle. And you have to, because if you're going to work as a detective, you're going to walk into scenes where the victim looks like your kid and is the age of your kid. Yeah. You're going to be able to work that? Yeah, because that kid's not in my circle. I intentionally excluded him from my circle. Okay, that might be practical, but it's not wise. And you will eventually suffer the consequence of that. And it's not biblical. Now, we're called to love our enemies. We're called to let people in our circle that we typically would not let in our circle. So it turns out that the data shows this. If you want to flourish, certain kind of friend is necessary. Number one, not 1,000 friends, not 100 friends. It's a small number of friends. That's the first criteria. You have to have a group of people that are tight and small. Because that's those kind of people you're going to go deep with. That's the second connector. They have to be deep divers, people who know you so well they're like family, and you've given them permission to say things about you that aren't flattering, to call you out when you're doing stupid things. That's the kind of deep diver you need, somebody you're that well connected with. And finally, you have to have virtuous friends, because I've worked cases where the woman who's killed was killed by somebody she called her best friend. Yeah. And she only had a small number of deeply connected friends, but they weren't virtuous. So virtue is unfortunately a criteria, and you see it in the data. They may not call it that, but that's what it is. And if you look at it, if you don't have a small number of deep diving virtuous friends, then you're not going to flourish at the highest possible level. So, and by the way, that means that you don't have to be Mr. Social. You just have to have people who you consider to be family, a handful of people that you can actually connect with that are not going to lead you astray because they hold virtue in a high regard. So that is what the data shows. And why would that be the case? Well, look, if you are worshiping Allah, I don't know why you would think that Allah is love. It's that, we know from scripture that Yahweh is described as love.
Right.
John describes it that way. God is love. Not that he can love. He created love. He liked to love you. No, that God is love. Well, why does he say it? That's a weird way to say it. God is love. Well, because under our view of God as triune, that Allah has no one to love until he creates something to love. There'd be not even an object to love until you create the universe and create the worlds in the universe, create Earth. Then you create humans on. Now you have people to love. But that would be a new experience because you never had people before you created them. There is a God out there, though, that has been in a love relationship from all eternity past between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. This idea of the lover, the beloved, and the spirit of love between them as being a core feature of God's nature because it's eternal. And that means when he creates humans in his image, we have an innate inclination toward this kind of deep diving, intimate community that's virtuous. Why? Because it turns out that the God of the universe is in a triune, intimate, deep diving, virtuous relationship. And that's why we flourish. It's not an accident that that's the kind of thing that makes us flourish, because it's a feature of the designer that is expressed through us. So I think this is why, if you move away from that, now look, guys, I know we're bad about that. We think we're pretty independent, and we're not from biochemistry. I think we're not designed to be as relational as others, but we have to make that effort. And I'm just suggesting you have at least a handful of people that who would go to bat for you, who would do whatever that's necessary. And that is a biblical concept. We ought to pursue it if we are Christians, especially.
Yeah, and certainly the mistake that I've seen some guys make, and I've even made before, is if you do welcome men into that circle, into your foxhole, into that 3 a.m. friend type of category, but then the first time they put some relational chips in the center of the table and challenge you on something, you stiff arm them, or you don't know me, and you react that way. Hopefully you've got a quick route to your apology, because that guy's probably not going to do that again, because he's like, oh, this guy, I thought this was a safe place to help this man, but it clearly wasn't. Now, I want to hop down to lead number 11, because this might have been my favorite chapter of the book. It's called The Killer Inside. And it's maybe because I'm just somewhat attracted to a little bit more of the macabre, some of the more intense type stuff, like the concept that, Jordan Peterson talks about from the book Ordinary Men, where if you always assume that you were going to be one of the righteous people in Nazi Germany, don't always just assume that you wouldn't have been one of those Polish police officers that somehow, little by little, you worked your way to where you were marching Jewish families into the middle of the woods, having them dig their own graves and then shooting them in the back of the head. Don't always think you would have been the hero. So I want to read a couple of quotes from this chapter and then get you to flow on it a little bit. Psychiatrist Carl Jung agreed with the sentiments of Schopenhauer, describing the dark side of human nature as an undeniable shadow. It's a frightening thought that man also has a shadow side to him, consisting not just of little weaknesses and foibles, but of positively demonic dynamism. There it is. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. If it is repressed, isolated from consciousness, it never gets corrected. And then here's a little quote from later on in the chapter. The real question, however, is this: do we learn how to be good because we are innately evil, or learn how to be evil because we are innately good? We certainly seem to have the capacity for decency and compassion, but researchers find we are fickle about goodness. Altruism seems rare, yet it is clearly an aspect of our nature despite our propensity towards evil. How can this be the case? Now, I've heard people go back and forth on this, even in Christian circles, because there are people that don't think that their kids are sinners. But then you can ask them simple questions like, well, did you teach your kid to interrupt? Did you teach your kid to be only focused on their own needs and to be supremely selfish? But then you also see people, I see this problem in a lot of churches where a lot of women will leave these churches thinking that they're not a depraved sinner. because the pastor, if they go at anybody, they're going at culture, or they're going at the men or something like that. And so a lot of these women are like, well, I sat in the front of class. I never got in trouble. Like, I take care of my house. I take care of my kids. Like, I've never cheated on my husband. I've never cheated on my taxes. So I'm good. And so I think some people have a tremendously low appreciation for the darkness that actually does exist inside of them. Some people will find that darkness in very astonishing moments. Maybe they'll experience trauma, and the thoughts of, maybe thoughts will be of suicide or of homicide or of just like, revenge consume them. And those feelings weren't there 5 minutes ago, but they're there now. So talk to me a little bit more about that, because I really think, especially for Christians, we don't really reckon with this enough because we don't really believe in our own depravity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're right. I mean, it seems kind of self-evident if you have kids, right? Like, you've experienced this, you don't. So one of the things about it is this: even the studies and surveys they do, in which they look at altruism, human altruism, what they discover is that, yes, we have the capacity to do great and beautiful things until resources get tight. In other words, we do those great and beautiful things for selfish reasons, typically. And then when resources get tight, we start hoarding toilet paper. Yeah, we'll be the giver of toilet paper until it's between you and me, and then I'm going to take it for myself.
Right.
There's research, I've cited it in the book, that shows this over and over and over again. So even our altruism is often driven selfishly. As a matter of fact, Luther said it this way. He said that we are so inwardly focused that even when we do something that appears to be morally good, and something that God might consider virtuous, we're doing it for all the wrong reasons. In other words, the person who appears to have it all together and checks every box, he's every bit in need of a savior as the person who's doing none of it. Because it turns out that dude who's checking every box is doing it so he can, number one, have a transactional relationship with God. I'm going to earn something on God's behalf, or I've got a transactional relationship with the other believers who are watching me, whatever it may be. The truth of the matter is, and you realize this work in cold cases, is that I work guys who just did one murder, and 30 years later, you would never guess they could ever even be capable of doing a murder.
Yeah.
Because they aren't serial killers. They are just guys who lost it, or women who lost it once. And then they lived the rest of their life in a morally upright way. We need to make a decision about this. And the data shows it. Look, if you define sin as just selfishness, just being self-focused, then you can kind of look at the story of Adam and Eve a little different way. When Eve is tempted, what does the serpent say? Did God really say that?
Yeah.
He just doesn't want you to know what he knows. It's all about selfishness. I want to be the authority. I want to be the determiner of good. That's a very strong temptation for all of us. And so if selfishness is the source of our fall, well, then you can see it in everything else we do. It's hard to argue that babies are not self-focused. It's hard to argue that's not a birth condition,
right?
Because it is, and that's what causes us, for example, that even when we're altruistic, to draw back at points, it's our selfishness, and it's our selfishness that causes us to want to adopt theistic systems in which we can just do the 8 things that please God, or the 10 things that please God, so we can say, I'm good. That dude's not as good as me.
Right.
Okay. It's all selfish, self-motivated behavior. Now, why does this even matter? Well, for a couple of reasons. I think if we think, for example, that humans are innately good and they just are corrupted by their families, their environments, their cultures, or systems, well, then it's easy to fix that. You just got to replace their families, environments, governments, and systems. And you already see that work. People are already trying to do that. On the other hand, if we determine that humans are in fact the corruptors of families, environments, governments, and systems, that's very different now. Now you know that no matter what system I could put in place, I could try to fix something. The dirty little humans who will now inhabit that system will find a way to corrupt that one, because it doesn't matter. This is why when our government was formed, it was formed around 3 branches that could self-check each other. You need that check and balance, because the founders recognized this fallen nature of humans, that if you give them control, we will mess it up. We need to have a balanced system that can hopefully somehow, even if only slightly, mitigate our fallen nature. So I think in the end, we have to make a decision. Which is it? Now, I think the data is clear. Even the secular data is clear. And you've seen lots of people push back on it and try to show how altruistic we are. They're not drilling to the bottom. We're only altruistic as it serves us. And that's what, if you look at some of the studies I'm showing in the book, you'll see that's true. Now, why does that matter? Well, here's why. It turns out that it's all about, there's a story in scripture of Jesus visiting Simon. And Simon's a Pharisee, has a big dinner, and who attends a woman from the city who was a sinner, according to scripture. Well, what was she doing? I don't know. But as she's lavishing Jesus and wiping his feet, and Simon didn't even clean Jesus' feet when he came in. Simon is thinking to himself, if this dude knew, if Jesus knew who this woman was, there's no way he'd let her touch him. Jesus knows what he's thinking. And so he says it. He offers a story. He says, Simon, if two people owe a bunch of money to somebody, one owes a ton, one owes a little, and both those debts are forgiven, who do you think is more happy to have their debt forgiven? And of course, Simon says the guy who owes a lot.
Right.
Here's the point of Jesus' story. The least forgiving people on planet Earth are the people who think they have nothing to be forgiven for. Simon was one of those. The least gracious people are people who think they don't have any need for grace. The woman knew her need for forgiveness, and she behaved very differently.
Right.
This is true for us too. If you think that you got it together and this guy doesn't, if you realize you're both completely broken, fallen, capable of the same great evil, but for situations, but for the grace of God, it could have been me who killed my wife. Now, you might say, well, it could never be. Look, when you work these cases, you realize these are just regular people, kind of like you said with Jordan Peterson. These are just regular people who did something horrific and then had to dismember the body and bury it. And you think, how can anyone do that? Well, they never did it again. 30 years later, they're now the deacon at your church. They're your doctor. They're your fire captain. They're whoever they may be, because they lived a regular life after that.
Right.
How could that be? Because they're just like us. And if you realize that, then here's what you realize when you're sitting at a table and you're interviewing someone at the other side of the table, some suspect who's in custody, you realize that table is not separating good from bad, righteous from evil. No, what it's separating is probably nothing more than the proud from the humble. And if you become humble, you'll realize, yeah, we're the same guy. We're all the same man or woman. We're all the same human being. Yeah, you could say maybe your buttons are harder to push than my buttons, but to be honest, they're all buttons that can be pushed, because that's just who we are at our core. And if nothing else, I think it'll help you to become more forgiving and more gracious with others when you realize that you're not much different.
It's so funny how you say it that way. When I spoke at Lewisburg prison, and I'm there with murderers, rapists, pedophiles, all kinds of people, I could sense that they thought there was something different between them and me. And so I did two things before my talk, because they were not compelled to be there. They was optional to come and hear me speak, but they hadn't had anyone come and speak to them in years. And so they were kind of like, all right, well, who's this random dude? So I introduced myself to everyone that walked in the room. Right. So that caught some of them off guard. Like I wasn't just standing in the front in my stab vest, hiding behind the guards or whatever. But then I didn't plan to do this, but as part of my intro, I said, look, guys, y'all think there's something different between you and me because I get to leave and you have to stay. Well, you violated the laws of man. That's why you're here. But all of us have violated the laws of God. So in that way, we are brothers. So if we can put that to the side as I talk to you guys for the next 60 minutes, I think that would be helpful. And you could kind of see a little bit of the tension came out of the room a little bit, because I wasn't standing, I wasn't hovering above these guys. It's like, look, I'm one wrong move. I'm one conscious decision away from being exactly where you are. We're not different. Like we've just made different decisions and we've ended up in different places. Now, Jim, I'm looking at the clock. I've got way more questions than I've got time. So we'll make this the last question of the day. I do want to give a little commercial for lead number 14, because that's kind of like the nuts and bolts of the book. That's called Death Sentences and Life Without Parole. And you encourage everyone to examine the evidence for God, examine the evidence for the soul, examine the evidence for the Bible, and to live with certainty. So that's obviously worth the price of admission just there. But I want to back up one chapter or one lead to lead number 13. And that's what gangsters have in common. So you were talking about how you were watching Boys in the Hood. So very classic movie for a lot of guys. And, obviously that's one of the movies that you would, of course, watch. You probably just watch that once a week. You rotate that in with Scarface and, some other movies like that. But here's the quote I wanted to read from that. I watched that scene. You were talking about a specific scene in the movie, and a light bulb came on. Every gangster I'd met so far and every gang member I encountered afterwards suffered from the same malady. Lack of dad. And I mean, we could have spent our entire time, Jim, just talking about the fatherlessness that we see in our culture, what that's leading to, the detriment and the rot of our culture. If dads were in the homes, I don't know that we see a lot of the rot in the West. And I don't think that's hyperbolic to say, yes, there are issues with government spending, and there's issues with, illegal immigration. There's issues with crime. There's issues with all this thing. But when dad is present, the statistics are absolutely astonishing. And that doesn't mean the dad's good. It doesn't mean the dad's theologically astute. It doesn't mean the dad's even great at being a dad. Just his mere presence in the home with his biological children, educational attainment goes way through the roof. Crime goes way down. Teen pregnancy goes way down. I think we've heard all the stats at this point, but just talk to me about this whole concept, because I mean, you've seen it firsthand with these gangbangers. They just don't have dad around, and it leads right to where they're at.
No, it's true, and that's not a statement about race or ethnicity or socioeconomic status or any of that. Because I first discovered it working in a city where we had a broad variety of young men involved in gangs from all sectors of our community. We had multi-generational Hispanic gangs. We had multi-generational Black gangs. We had, multi-generational white gangs in the south part of our city. And we had a group of Korean gangsters on the west side that were probably the most active of all the groups. So what's going on here? It's not about race. It wasn't about where they were living, because some of them were living in very nice homes and had, intact families. What's going on here? And then I had a partner who wanted, this Boys in the Hood movie just came out. And I said, I want to watch a movie on my days off about the stuff we're doing every day at work, right? I'm not interested. But he says, no, you need to watch this movie because it's different. It's not just like a gangster movie. It's a movie that really is thoughtfully addressing the issues in culture right now. So I watched the movie with my wife. And I remember thinking, it shook me a little bit. And here's why. It's true. It's lack of dad. And lack of dad looks different depending on the group. Sometimes it's that I never knew dad. My mom never introduced me to dad. Sometimes it's, my dad's been locked up my whole life. Sometimes it's that my dad's just a drunk who's not involved. He's home, but he's just not, he's like a deadbeat. Sometimes it's, my dad's a workaholic. He never even bothered to learn the English language. He's got a business. We make great money. He's a great provider, but he's never home. It doesn't matter what version of lack of dad you're in. They seem to produce the same results in the gangsters I was working. And I was thinking at the time, because I was really consumed by my career, like, how much am I home? Especially when you work in gangs, it's an investigative position, at least back when I worked at our agency. So we had to take it all the way from developing the case, making the arrest, filing the case with the DA, walking it through the process, being in court. It was like start to finish. I was never home. It felt like I was working 60, 70 hours a week. So I'm thinking, my kids were 2 and 4. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, this is me. I'm in the same group. I'm not home. And it changed the way I did everything from that point on. It turns out that feature of our culture right now, the number of fatherless homes, matters. Dads matter, especially from a cop perspective, because the number of crimes you see, it seems like, when you have risky behavior in young men and young women, it looks slightly different. Now, you do see a lot of crime with young women, especially in these smash and grabs and stuff we're seeing around the country. They're pretty, it could be both men and women doing those kinds of things, but usually violent crimes, because we're driven by our testosterone. Men kind of own those. Risky behavior with women often takes it could be teenage pregnancy. It could be a lot of other risky drug use, a lot of other risky behavior, but violence is not always at the top of that list. It is for men. So when you are working these kinds of crimes, you got to be aware of that. So why does it matter? Well, and why is this the case? Why is it that we are so, this is not to say anything about the benefit of moms, of course, but many of the men that I was taking to jail, young men I was taking to jail, they had an intact mom at home who actually was engaged. But like in the movie Boys in the Hood, she eventually, the mom drops the boy off at the dad's house in the Crenshaw district and says, look, I cannot teach him how to be a man. That's something that a man has to do. It's so interesting. If you are geeked out, if you ever scroll through your Instagram and you get stuck in these videos, right? Like these reels, and you're like, why am I I need to turn this thing off? But I will constantly find pep talks by coaches in athletics, college athletics, and they recorded the pep talk. And you know what that pep talk is? It's dad stuff.
Yep.
It's often, let me tell you the stuff that your dad never told you for whatever reason. Maybe he wasn't engaged. Maybe he wasn't home. Maybe whatever it might be, whatever lack of dad version you have, coaches find themselves becoming that surrogate. And by the way, surrogates work often.
Sure.
So a good mentor, the person who had the biggest impact on me, and I love my dad. I'm in his profession. He was a cop before me. I don't think in my family anyone could say they love dad as much as I do. But the man who changed me forever was my grandfather, because he was more available to me. And his name is Warner. So I use his name, J. Warner Wallace, because it's a tribute to the man who did for me what I needed. He was the kind of guy I could sit with and who would just take time with me and talk about a bunch of nothing that turned out to be everything. And that's what we have to do as men, is just be available. And what instead we try to do is we say, well, I'm not much available, but when I am, I'm going to be really targeted. Okay, your kids don't want that. I don't want that. I don't need a lesson from you once a week. I instead just need you to be present. We talk about this a lot as we work with wounded veterans and wounded police officers, that often they'll tell you their story. And there's not much I can say. There's not a lot of great advice I can give you. I've not been through that, what you just described. And I don't know that I'm even qualified to say anything. So, what ends up happening is we call it a ministry of presence.
Yep.
What they need me to do is simply be present and be empathetic. And if you're a dad listening to this, I want to encourage you. Yeah, it's quality, but it is quantity also. The lack is not a quality lack. It's a time lack. A lack of dad means you're just not around. And you might think, I'm not good at this. I'm not comfortable with it. Doesn't matter. Just be present. Whatever you're thinking about, talk about it with your son, your daughter. Things change. So it's important for us to realize that and by the way, all the studies show that. The only studies that don't show that are biased studies in which people are trying to say that any family formation will work. Well, sorry, I hate to say this, but guys, it's two biological parents in a low conflict setting is the secret sauce to success. No, I wasn't raised that way. My parents divorced when I was very young, 3. My mom never remarried, one biological parent, and it wasn't always in a low conflict setting. But you can come out okay. But the best secret sauce for success for kids is 2 biological parents in a low conflict setting. And that means your dads need to be available and need to be in that low conflict setting.
Yeah, I mean, sociologists usually will catch up to the Bible. Sometimes it's hundreds of years late, but yeah, it's, 2 biological parents in a low conflict environment and going to church. Like that is where you see human flourishing to an extreme degree. And again, no, there's not a particular type of church or particular denomination or particular type of dad in a particular type of city making a certain amount of money. Like it's just that. Right. I mean, you've probably heard it before. Kids spell love Time. And I've even here recently, I'm looking at the next 2 quarters of my business and the different times I'm going to be gone. And I'm like, wait a minute, we got to make some changes here or there because this is too much time in too short a period that I'm going to be gone too much. Absolutely not. We got to make that change because my boys are 4 and 2, Jim. And so like, that's the thing where we're in that core. Yeah. We're in that core time period.
Right. You're seeing the same thing. Well, I'm going to give you a practical assessment that'll help you. So here was my strategy before, I got into my 60s. It was that I would always, if I had to travel, and like I did some speaking when I first wrote books. So for 10 years, I was on the speaking circuit. But my strategy was always to be able to tell Susie, I'll see you the day after tomorrow. So I can't take an event in which I can't tell Susie, I'll see her the day after tomorrow. Now I'm at a point where I won't take an event if I can't tell Susie, I'll see you tomorrow. So here's what that means.
Yeah.
It means if you want me to speak at a nighttime event, I have to be able to fly out that day, do the event that night, fly home tomorrow morning, be home by noon. Because I'll be gone from Susie about 30 hours. I won't do it. Here's what happens. Kyle, what happens, and you're going to see this too, is that we hold 2 things at value. I know we're getting short on time. 2 things of value. It's time and money. When you're young, you're willing to exchange the time you have to make the income you need to support your family. I get it. Money is at the higher value. As you get old, especially if you're retired with a pension, the entire thing's going to flip. Now, the thing of highest value is time. As a matter of fact, there's been some events I signed up for a year ago. As I'm getting older, I'm like, you know what? Can I just pay you not to come? Because it turns out the time is super important to me. And I don't feel like I have a lot, right? Because I'm in my state. I feel like I'm on the back three and I can see the clubhouse and I don't want to waste any time. So what we have to do as dads is realize that balance, yes, you have to make income, but time has value. Even when you're young, and you don't think about it until you get to be
value
old.
of money, for sure.
That's right. So just keep those things in mind as you're raising your own kids. This time thing is valuable. It's worth by the way, when you get to be my age, if someone said, I can give you that year when your son was 4, I can give you a month with him at the age of 4. What would it be worth to you? I suspect you'd give anything. So don't take this for granted. I always think to myself, hey, what would a day be worth with my wife 15 years from now, especially if they could guarantee me I could have a day like I had in 2024. Well, it turns out I have that day. It's called today.
Right.
So what am I going to do with it? Time matters.
So one more question, because I have to go a little bit deeper on what you just said, because I think this is a very, very important thread that we're pulling out little by little. So you're exactly right. I am in the point in my career where I will, trade the time with my wife and my boys so that I can go make the money. Maybe that's a speaking engagement that I'm being paid to do, or maybe that's, maybe that's time totally here where I'm in my home studio, but I'm not home. Like you do not come up here. You do not knock on the door. Like, studio is on and the red light is on. Do not come up here. And so talk to me about that tension, because I've heard someone, it was kind of a crude joke, but it made sense. It's like women will complain no matter what. If their man makes a ton of money, makes a really good living, but isn't home enough, they'll complain about the fact that you're not home enough. But if you're super present and home and you're there at all the practices and all that, but you're struggling in your career, they're going to piss and moan about the fact that you're not making enough money and how are we going to pay these bills, right? And so I saw another meme again. I guess I think in memes, there was a meme where it was like, men only think about one thing. And then it showed a man and the things that he was thinking about. Man, I don't want to become like my father. Man, how are we going to make next month mortgage payment? Man, how are we going to do this? And it's like, there is a pressure on a man that women just can't, they can maybe appreciate, but they can't understand. And the same works in the opposite. Okay.
Right.
But,
it's just different kind of pressure. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Jim, you're talking to a lot of young guys right now that are young to medium in their families or young to medium in their careers. And part of it is like, I have to provide, like, we can't pay the bills with hopes and dreams, and we can't pay for college and retirement with, Bible studies and prayer circles. Like at a certain point, you've got to put pen to paper. Yeah. You've got to hit the pavement. You've got to knock the doors. Talk to me a little bit about that tension, because I'm right there where I'm like, I'm saying no to certain opportunities where I can make some money because it's going to be too much time away. But where do you draw the line, Jim?
Well, okay. So setting up good policies up front is important. Boundaries. So the boundary for me was, I got to be able to tell her I'll see you the day after tomorrow. So that means that sometimes people will say, well, can you come out and do this? Well, no, because I couldn't get home the day after tomorrow, but I could if you adjust the schedule slightly, then I can do it, because my policy to my own, I've never, ever had an event planner where I said, here's my policy with my bride, that they didn't honor it, because they get it. They get it. They want to honor your policy with your bride. So set that policy up front. And when someone asks you to do an event or whatever it may be, consider it. Now, here's the second thing. It's a chapter of this book. Look, all of us want financial independence. If you had financial independence, this wouldn't even be an issue, right? Well, what is financial independence? It's not the ability to buy anything. It's the ability to buy anything you want. And I don't want anything. So I knew when I retired, I would have financial independence, because I'm not moving. I've been in this house for 30 plus years. I still drive Hyundais. My wife's car is 15 years old, almost 16 years old. Like we're not, and I married someone who could live in a tent, who would have said all along, if we could be home more, I'd rather live in an apartment, whatever we could afford. So here's the hard decision to make. If you're living in an area where you feel like you can't make it and hold the schedule you need to make to be a good husband and a good father, move. I know that sounds brutal.
Yeah. But
you may have to. And to be honest, by the way, what am I trying to do with all this? Where's this house? I'm going to die. It's not like I get a better spot in heaven if I die with money. It doesn't I just need enough to finish. I don't need I'm not trying to build an empire. People think, oh, there's money in books. Okay, if you're writing Christian apologetics books, I hate to wake you up here, but maybe if you started before Amazon came online, you might be making some money doing this. But most of the time, this is not, you should not do this because you can make money doing it. And besides, the speaking events, I don't want to be away from home. So those aren't like positives for me. And I started off with a pension. I live on 60% of my pension. And why? Because I don't want anything. But we've thought about it. Should we remodel the kitchen? Yeah, well, why?
Yeah.
Like, what's going to be so much different about a remodeled kitchen? Maybe we will someday. I doubt it. We talked about these things. Like, what do you want out of life? So it turns out that all of this is just determined by the tail that wags the dog is your wants. And if you're going to live in your wants, then get ready. That tail will wag every dog. So what I've said is, if what I wanted was time, well, that becomes the tail that wags the dog. And now I got to cut some things back. I got to look at all the memberships I have. I got to look at all the stuff I'm spending money on. What am I really doing here? What can I cut back? And it's not because it's not that you don't have the capacity to make a lot of money. Kyle, I know you could probably, if you put your mind to it, you could do something unbelievable, but you'll sacrifice something to do it. Largely your family. And you'll sacrifice. You will never, I always say this, regret does not live on anything that has to do with your money-making ability or your job. You will never at the end of the day say, man, I wish I could have made more money. Man, I tell you, I wish I could have been a better detective. No, that's all in the rearview mirror. Let me tell you what lasts is your marriage. You're going to have most regret about your marriage and your family and your parenting. So if I can tell you that's coming, every one of you who's in your 30s, that regret is coming. So why don't you head it off right now? You could. And it means you have to do the things that eliminate regret. They're almost all time related. They're not money related. Regret does not really live in the money house. It lives in the time house. So if you want to have less regrets in the future, attack that now. And if you think, well, yeah, but right now my friends are living at a certain level. Trust me, when you get to the end, they're going to be envious of you because you won't have the regret that they have. So now is the time to make those decisions.
Papa Warner Wallace, that's your new nickname after all that wisdom that you just dropped on all the men on this show. But hey, I really enjoyed our conversation as always, but that's all for me. Is there anything else you want to get off your chest?
No, thanks, Kyle, for having me. I really appreciate it. Just love the opportunity to talk about the stuff that matters most. So I appreciate you.
Well, Jim, keep writing books. We'll keep having you on. Until next time.
Thanks.
There you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed Jim's third appearance on the show. But before we let you go, we are going to do a quick resilience boost. At Undaunted.Life, our mission is equipping men to push back darkness with content that forges spiritual, mental, and physical resilience. So I've got links for you today. I've got a link to Jim's website. I've got a link to where you can buy your copy of The Truth in True Crime. I've also got a link to Jim's YouTube channel and his 2 previous appearances on the show. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Wherever you're listening to this, please subscribe, rate, and leave us a positive 5-star review. If you want me to come speak live at your event or on your podcast, just shoot me an email to info@Undaunted.Life. That's info@Undaunted.Life. Follow us on Instagram and like us on Facebook, and check out our website for everything else, including how to donate to keep more content like this coming your way. Just go to www.Undaunted.Life. And as always, we want to thank the band Holy Name for allowing us to use their music for our content. The music on this podcast is their song Perpetua, which is off their self-titled debut album on Face Down Records. The links are in the description. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Remember, keep pushing back darkness, keep forging spiritual, mental, and physical resilience, keep seeking the Lion of Judah.